Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Lagerquist. I'm here at Vine Faith in Action for what has become a very successful monthly Vine author series, and we expect that will continue today with our guest, Kirstin Cronn-Mills. And I'm sorry, I sometimes drop a Kier sound in there.
No, that's right.
Oh, it
Kirsten
is.
is right.
Kirstin,
That's
okay.
correct.
And there was no J, so I wasn't sure.
No, right.
But
True.
we will be learning a little bit about her work, how she comes about it. She was telling us beforehand that she's been in a writer's group for 17 years. And of course, that, like so many other things, is how you hone your craft. You share it with others, you learn from what you have done, and then you get better as you move forward. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to ask people if they can mute themselves. If not, I will go about and do that. But if you can do that, and I will pass it off to Kirstin.
Hi, everybody. It's very nice to see you today. Thanks for coming. I know that last month you had Becky Fiallen Brooks, come to speak with. And Becky's also in my writing group. She's actually the one that started our writing group 17 years ago. And she, I think, told you about why it's important for you to tell your story. And I'm going to tell you about what happens when you do tell your story, because I am going to show you the effects of that. And I'm going to show that to you related to my grandma, who was quite the unusual woman. So let me share my screen here and we'll get started. So what I'm going to do is we'll kind of go back and forth between the screen and some other stuff. Come back. Oh, why did you do that? Okay, that's not going to work, is it? Okay. There we go. All right, we're going to have to do it this way, right? I don't think we can do the full screen. I have a cat that's like bothering me back here, just so you know. Every time I start to talk, she wants to be petted. You can kind of see her tail there. So you'll have to forgive me if we get kitty cuddles involved in all of this. So here's our first screen. This is called Intergenerational Inspiration. My name is Kirstin Cronn-Mills, and my grandmother's name was Doris Evelyn Nylander Cronn Patterson Nielsen Eltoft. My grandma was married 3 different times, which is part of her uniqueness. And my unique kid just walked by making noise. So we'll just have that all going on too. It's quite the deal. So here is my grandma, right? Doris Evelyn Nylander Cronn Patterson Nielsen Eltoft. I did not understand how unique my grandma was until I moved away and kind of reflected on my grandma and thought what kind of an unusual person she really was. She was the daughter of people who homesteaded in Nebraska in Phelps County, which I'll show in just a minute. People who homesteaded from Sweden. And it's a little factoid for you that Nebraska, I think, is the state that had the most homestead claims in the United States. So that brings with it its own conversation. But her parents came from northern Sweden in the 1800s. And the reason why I picked today to talk about my grandma is because my grandma loved to write. And so I have all sorts of things from her that we can use to talk about why it is that I like to write. And I wouldn't be a writer without my grandma. So why are we talking about my grandma? Because she is my birthday twin. I was her gift for her 56th birthday. And we just had a birthday at the end of December. So that always made me very special to her and her to me. She was also my grandma because my grandma had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. And the daughter and the middle son moved away from Nebraska. And my dad stayed in Nebraska, which is where I was raised. So for me, she was literally my grandma. All of my faraway cousins didn't matter in the scheme of things. I knew they were there and I knew them. She was my grandma. So I always feel very protective of her and very glad to have had her in my life. Not everybody gets to grow up with a grandma, and so it's a real privilege. We also have very similar brains. We kind of approach the world in the same way, and we think in similar ways. She thought in similar ways that I do. So that makes us birthday twins in other ways. And she's also one of my very first memories. And I did not realize she was one of my very first memories until I was at school And I'll tell you a little bit more about me in just a minute. I teach at South Central College, and I was doing something for some literature class somewhere and came across the poem, The Pasture by Robert Frost. And in my head, I can see my grandma's face. I shan't be gone long, you come too. So I'm going to read you that poem. And we'll talk a little bit later about how my grandma was raised in a very literary family, because that's what people had, right? We didn't have TV, we had some radio, but books were what they had. And my grandma's family was very much into books. So this is The Pasture by Robert Frost. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away and wait to watch the water clear, I may. I shan't be gone long. You come too. I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young, it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long. You come too. And that's what I see in my brain as I see my grandma saying, you come too. And I had no idea that memory was in there until that poem pulled it up for me. And I was like, oh my goodness, what a beautiful thing. So let's talk a little bit. Oh, sorry. Like I said, she's one of my first memories. I wouldn't be a writer without her. And so that intergenerational inspiration is what I would like to talk with you about today. So briefly about me. I grew up in Nebraska. I'll show you briefly here. This county with the red sort of a circle around it is the county where I grew up. That's Dawson County. And this red county is where my grandma grew up, and that's Phelps County. So we weren't too far apart. This is where her family came in the late 1800s from Sweden. And they had, I think her dad had a brother that was already living there and that had come maybe a little bit earlier. And her family liked to tell the story that when her dad was maybe 12, he had kind of a vision of this new country and this new place to live, and that was Phelps County. I don't know one way or the other. I'm just saying that's great. So anyway, so that's where she lived she lived in Nebraska all of her life, but that's where she started her life. This is where I started my life. I lived in Nebraska until I was 23. I met my husband, Dan, who was originally from Lake Crystal, and met him at the University of Nebraska. He was working on his PhD while I was an undergrad, and he ended up getting a job at MSU, where he had done his undergrad and his master's degree. So we ended up moving back to Minnesota. He moved back to Minnesota. I moved to Minnesota. I've been here for almost 29 years. It'll be 20 years. And I started teaching that very first year that we moved here. So I've been a teacher for 9 years as well. And I've been 23 years at SCC. So I did my grad school at Iowa State. I did my PhD at Iowa State. And so I taught there and drove back and forth for some years. And then, not to be jamming things together, but I walked across the graduation stage pregnant with our son. So there was not a lot of break between grad school and motherhood, and that was fine. And lucky for me, I got that job at SCC, because usually when you have two couples that are in academia, it's pretty hard to find a job where you can both live in the same town. I know Pat's daughter and son-in-law, Mary Pat and John, and I know how far John drives every day to go to school, and we don't have to do that. So we're very lucky in that. So grad school, motherhood, writing took a back seat to a lot of that. And I have been writing all along. I started writing poems when I was a girl. It's probably the time I really started a lot, although I remember something in second grade or so. But I didn't write a novel until 2003. And I wrote that novel because I had a high school classmate call me up. Out of the blue. This was not before the internet, but just as the internet was beginning. So I'm not sure how she found me. And she said, do you know why I was so mean to you in high school? And I said, nope, don't have any idea. And she said, well, it's because I had a crush on you. And I said, oh. And that, of course, was not something that we talked about in the 80s. We didn't talk about gay people. We didn't think about gay people. But of course, gay people were where they were. And so the first novel that I wrote, which I'm going to read to you from in a minute, is called The Sky Always Hears Me and the Hills Don't Mind. And this is set in an imaginary hometown, like my hometown. And it's a novel that said to that woman, if you would have told me in the 80s that you had a crush on me, it would have been just fine. But my grandma is in this novel. She's definitely a novel. I'll read about that in just a minute. Yeah, so Saga, Nebraska. I squared this box out here because this is where my grandma is buried. She and her husband, her first husband, was my grandfather, and I never got to meet him. He was killed in a car accident about 2 years, not quite 2 years before I was born. And his family is from out here. They were homesteaders out in Banner County, and so she's buried out here with him. But I just want you to keep that in mind because I have a visual for you about that later on. So here is my grandma. This is my grandma when she started teaching. And my grandma started teaching when she was 17. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of her writing just to give you a feel for who she was. And so you can see maybe a little bit about how we're related. So like I said, I'm really lucky that I have writing of my grandma's, and my grandma did her writing in lots of different ways. This writing, I think here, which is mostly autobiographical, was done for a Phelps County publication, like the 100th anniversary of Phelps County or something like that. She also used to do radio shows for folks. At the top, it says radio program for shut-ins. So, I think we wouldn't probably call them shut-ins now, but radio program for folks who, can't leave the house, which is a lot of us right now during the pandemic. So she would have been right at home. Oh, and before I get started with that, maybe I should show you the other books that I've written. So The Sky Always Hears Me and the Hills Don't Mind was my first book. Beautiful Music for Ugly Children is my second book. This book happens to be set in Mankato, a fictional version of Mankato that's called Maxfield. Original Fake is my third book, and this book is set in the Twin Cities. This is an illustrated novel, illustrated by a friend of mine who lives in the cities whose name is Eric Johnson. And then my fourth novel is Wreck. That's kind of hard to see because the cover is shiny, but that's the lighthouse on the Duluth walk, the Duluth Lake Walk. This book is set in Duluth. So for my Minnesota books, I kind of just went up the state for the settings, which kind of works for me. Anyway, I've continued to write poetry, but those are my four novels. I'll talk about my fifth novel when we get closer to the end. So back to my grandma. Okay, so let me read you just a couple paragraphs from her autobiography that she wrote for the Phelps County Historical Society. And this will just give you a little feeling about who she is. She was born in 1912, so that sets the picture a little bit for you. She was the oldest of 4 children. I remember very clearly the day Ruth was born. I was farmed out down the road to Uncle Howard's. I wet my pants and Aunt Elvira shamed me. I was totally degraded. I remember clearly that Aunt Jenny and Hattie Dane were there to take care of Mother and keep things going. And when I said darn one day, I was invited to go by myself if I wanted to talk that way. So I went into the front bedroom, virtual exile, and hid behind Dad's bass horn box and said darn as many times as I could. Already a Bolshevik. And I think my grandma uses the word Bolshevik not in the political sense, but in the sense of kind of the power to the people sense, because my grandma was kind of all about power to the people. So she graduated she graduated with 5 other women, I think, and they had a long history, like 50 years of class reunions where they all were able to attend, which was pretty great. But this tells you a little bit about her teaching. So right after she graduated, she said, and this I think was the fall of 1929, if I remember right. Within the week, I left for Nebraska Wesleyan, and before my 17th birthday that year, I had earned 12 college hours, passed all the teacher's exams, and had taught 1 semester of country school. It couldn't be done now and shouldn't have been then. I never yearned toward being a teacher. I wanted to be a concert pianist, and I'll believe yet that I could have been. But those were desperate times in Phelps County, so I taught each winter I could get a school and went to school in the summertime on borrowed money, then taught to pay it back. In that way, after 31 years, with 1 semester in winter school and the remaining hours in summer school, off campus and extension, I walked in the same graduation line with our daughter in 1960. And for all my 28 years of dealing with the most precious commodity in this world, children's minds, my pension is about enough to pay my phone bill each month, which I think is totally fair. Teachers' pensions are still not very great. Okay, so hang on to that idea of I wanted to be a concert pianist. My grandma, like I said, had a pretty spectacular brain, and she did really amazing things with music. I can't see all of you right at the moment, but I'm assuming that some of you have some knowledge about music. And my grandma played both the piano and the organ. She had a full-size concert organ, church organ in her house. And she played all the time for churches and all that kind of stuff. But my grandma had perfect pitch, and my grandma could also change the keys of songs in her head while she was playing them. I've never met anybody who could do that, ever. And of course, we thought, everybody's grandma could do that, right? That's pretty whatever. No, nobody's grandma can do that. Nobody's grandma. So when I decided to write Sky, I decided to incorporate her and incorporate our relationship into the book. And it's a fictional relationship, of course, but I wanted to incorporate looking back as a grown-up on her and thinking about what it would be like to have, if you were a high school kid who had all sorts of weird stuff going on, what would it be like to have a grandma that was super supportive? So I did that, but I gave her the life that she wanted. So I want to read that to you. The Sky Always Hears Me and the Hills Don't Mind is called that because the main character, Morgan, lives in a river valley that's 35 miles wide, which is very different, of course, than the Minnesota River Valley. And when she's really frustrated and mad, she goes out about 5, 6, 7 miles, and she sits on the side of that river valley and she screams at the sky. And she says, the sky always hears me and the hills don't mind. So she's driving back from doing that while she's thinking about her grandma. My mind is on Grandma as I drive back into town. She lives at 120 West 11th Street, Central Nowhere, and she is my secret weapon for sanity. I love her to death, and not just because of her Amazon account, with which she will buy me almost any book I ask for. She is definitely the reason why I love words, and we have the same birthday. She says I was the premier gift for her 51st and the best present she's gotten in her whole life. She is strange and cool in lots of ways. She belongs to Nebraskans for Peace, and she's been married 3 times, which is very odd for a grandma from Central Nowhere. But also, she was a concert pianist, which is not your usual occupation. And she started when she was 20. She was that good. So if I'm going to live up to her creative legend, I better get my writing ass in gear. Morgan wants to be a novelist. She played a lot with the Omaha Symphony, which you wouldn't think was such a great symphony since it's in nowhere, but they've won all sorts of awards. Plus, she did a lot of solo work and contracts with other orchestras, so she's been all over the world, as well as to all 50 states. We both like the color pink, and she still does. Plus, she's very witty. On the door to her garage, she has a Post-it note tacked to the frame right at her eye level. All it says is teeth, ? Hair, ! I think it's the funniest note in the entire universe. She's my dad's mother, and she's the sanest person in my biological crowd. She calls me Morgan Le Fay, like the high priestess of Avalon. She likes to claim I'm named after that Morgan, but I'm sure I'm not. My mom and dad weren't that imaginative. Grandma tells me I get my powers of language and my beauty from Morgan Le Fay, but I tell her I got those things from her. It's not like she doesn't love my brothers, Martin and Evan, because she does, and they love her back. And she'd probably loan her car to Martin, too, if he were old enough to drive it. Morgan is driving her grandma's car at this moment. But she's my grandma, mine, and I'm hers. Let's see. If I were truly a sorceress like the real Morgan, I'd zap the two of us right out of here. We'd go live by the ocean and read a book a day. We both can do that. Read a whole book in a long day. My personal best was 425 pages until the 7th Harry Potter came out. Then it was 756 pages in 12 hours, which won me the Nerd of the Century Award. Anyway, that's a little bit about my grandma. And that was my real grandma. So this is a birthday picture of us. I was turning 18 and she was turning 74. And here in this box is chocolate covered cherries. That was one of her favorite things. And since my dad and my grandma are both gone, I don't have anybody to give chocolate covered cherries to at Christmas time. Our birthday is right after Christmas. And so I just give them to random people. This year I gave them to my letter carrier, who is a friend of mine, and she lost her wife a couple years ago. And I handed her this box and I said, I know you'll understand when I give you a box of something that I wanted to give to somebody who's gone. And she said, oh, those were Tracy's favorite candies. I was like, oh, great, perfect. Here you go. So one of the reasons why my grandma was so great, and one of the reasons why she was so good at writing, and how she helped me be good at writing, is because we're pretty good at details. So I just included this as a picture because here's a little detail for you about Nebraska. In Nebraska, it used to be that when you were licensing your car, you could go to the courthouse and you could say, I want a license plate that has the letter whatever in it. And they would say, oh, okay. So our family were all K's. My dad's name was Keith. And so he went to the courthouse and said, I want a license plate that starts with a K. And this is the license plate he got. Anyway, this is just an example. You can see that it's pretty old, right? But those are the kinds of things that make writing interesting and make writing important, is the details. And the cool thing, if you want to be a writer, is that you have to pull those details out, and you have to be super judicious about what those details are. You have to sort of figure out what's useful to keep and what's too much. And sometimes I know, especially in my first drafts, I have way too many details, and my grandma does too. But the details are kind of the key. And like Becky was saying last month, only you have stories that you can tell, right? Only you have details that you can include. So here is an example of a paragraph of details from my grandma, and I think this was also written for the shut-ins. It starts, Dear Dumplings. This must be for grandkids, because she wouldn't address the shut-ins as Dear Dumplings. So this must be for us. Dear Dumplings, there is nothing on television but a Dolly Parton show, and that turns me on about as much as walking barefoot through cold oatmeal. Television can be exciting or horrifying or brutal or educational. That's what does turn me on, or just boring. But too much of it is a little bit of a time waster, and I deplore that, for there are everlastingly more good books to read. Wasn't it Mark Twain who said, the man who does not read is no better off than the man who can't read? But then, when I remember sitting with Kathy late one night, watching Neil Armstrong stretch his foot down on the moon's surface, I know that television has brought us some great blessings. So I like what she does in that paragraph, because she's got, this is a time waster. Dolly Parton to me is not a time waster, but would have been to her. And then she brings it back around by saying, look, here's this moment that was so important to culture. And we got to watch it on TV. So she was pretty good at kind of balancing that stuff out. This one I know is for the shut-ins because it says at the top, and she wrote this when I was in high school. And it's dated 22 January 1986. And I'm reading this because it has relevance to where we are right now in the deep freeze. This happens to be about weather in Nebraska in January. This fantastic, incredible, unbelievable, unreasonable, thoroughly delightful weather has dumbfounded all of us to the point where we've worn out all our superlatives, run out of adjectives, and are almost terrified ourselves, anticipating the change we know has to come. After all, we are Nebraskans, and we can recall other bits of paradise in the reprieve from a regular, seasonable, miserable, bone-chilling, and tooth-clattering winter. I can recall a Christmas day in my childhood where we took pictures in no coats, and a year when trees began budding in the last 2 weeks of January and then died, many of them. but it's not common, and we all love it. We even yearn for it to remain, even though, as licensed Nebraskans, we have to consider the fate of our agriculture if we were suddenly to get our wish. Winter is a necessary part of our area, and we can enjoy certain features of its makeup, especially if you're a ski buff, and we can revel in the gorgeous sunrises and sunsets. And so, as card-carrying Nebraskans, we can think of the different types of weather that are our despair and our privilege, and know that each one has its own beauty. So, she's using, in that particular situation, she's using all those adjectives, right, for big effect. And, that's pretty amazing when you have a January thaw. I'm sure she was talking about a January thaw. And you just want to kind of bring that all to mind. She does that by sort of emphasizing very stridently what it was that she wanted us to feel about the weather. So, that purse, I circled that purse. This is just a picture of my brother. This is my brother, who's not quite a year younger than me. His birthday is the day before our birthday. So he was my birthday present for my first birthday. We're sitting out at a place called Camp Kamika, which was a Methodist church camp that was south of our town. And you can kind of see the hills that Morgan would sit and yell about back here in the background. There's actually a lake down here at the bottom. And it was, Minnesotans would be embarrassed to call it a lake. They would probably call it a mud puddle. It was big, but it was just muddy, muddy, muddy. It was gross. But there's the lake down there. So we're sitting back there at a family reunion, and she and I are talking, and she has her trademark giant purse. Oh my goodness, the stuff in the purse, right? Who knew it could be anything? It always was something to read in there. But you never knew what else was in there. And so I bring the purse up just to say that that's one of those details that when you're thinking about details, you can sort of see, you can maybe imagine a purse and what's in the purse, right? Each scene that you want to write about, or each story that you want to write about, is going to have those kinds of details. And sometimes details can give you the exact picture of a person or a place or a thing very carefully by those carefully placed details. So that purse would have been one of the things that I would talk about if I was going to write a profile of my grandma. And when I saw that picture, I just thought, yeah, I need to put that in there because I want you all to see her purse. All right, so it's 2:30, a little past 2:30. So I think it's time for you all to do some writing. And hopefully you have a piece of paper and a pen, or something to write with, pencil, magic marker, crayon, whatever it would be. And so I just want you to think for a moment about what story you might want to tell. Because again, we're going for intergenerational inspiration. So what would you like people to know? This is a bit of a different tack, but I just saw on social media when people were talking about how it used to be 35 years ago that you could raise a family on one salary. You could do all sorts of things on one salary. And people don't know that now, right? What kinds of things would you like people to know about your youth, or about your upbringing, or about where you lived something? And what would be those details in that story? So just take a moment, pick one story that you might want to tell, and just start listing some details. They don't have to be in order. This is just brainstorming. So don't shame yourself about what it is. Just take a moment, think of your story, maybe write it at the top of your page, and then put down some details. We'll take 5-ish minutes. So it's 2:34. We'll come back at 2:40. All right. So just take some time to think about that. I am going to stop my share right now so I can see you all. There we go. Does anybody have anything that they want to share? You don't have to, obviously, but if you have a story idea that you want to share and a couple details from that you generated from your writing moment, I would love to hear them. We would love to hear them. My cat is busy being a terror, and so that's why I keep leaving. Cats and children and Zooms, not so much.
Well, I can start just because this is something I've been working on some memoir of my own. So I wrote about this just a couple of weeks ago. Summers at Leech Lake. Just some of the details were we owned a yellow K-Yacht motorhome that we always took up
Nice.
there with a big kind of a blunt nose to it. We stayed at a place called Travel Trailer Terrace that was terraced rows where people would park their motorhomes and their trailers and their cars. So you'd have to kind of walk down in between them to get down to the lake. And once there, you got the marina that was kind of, think about if Florida were extended into the shoreline. The guy who owned the place had cut out the marina so that people could store their boats right nearby and just zip out into the lake. He was always running around there. He was a small but athletic built guy, and he was always running around doing something around the campground. We had card games at our dinette in the motorhome. And us boys, a motorhome that usually had a place where you'd store blankets. Ours had a place where you stored alcoholic beverages. So we learned how to make the perfect Manhattan using vermouth and gin and the other ingredients. Our Uncle Clayt and our cousins would stay at the cabins, which were just on the other side of the small little band of woods that was very mosquito-laden trail that went between the two. And my last detail I'll mention is that we did some water skiing, and we had very old skis with hard plastic that would cut a little groove into the back of your heel. And because it was Leech Lake, there were leeches. And what we would find is that I remember one time we were pulling the boat in onto the trailer, and I got back inside and we traveled down the road, and I looked down and there was a leech hanging on to the bloodied spot on the back of my heel. So
yuck. But those are great. Those are great details, right? Your reader is going to see so much. I mean, you could tell by my face that I was seeing all that stuff, right? That's what details are for. That's exactly what details are for. Is there maybe one other person who would want to share?
I have a similar story.
Okay.
Mine is about swimming with my dad and brother. And we lived in Austin, Minnesota. But on really hot days, Dad would take us swimming in Blooming Prairie, which isn't too far from Austin. And it was a place where he used to hunt ducks. It was a farmer's swimming hole. Was not really a pond. It wasn't really, and when we got there, there was a tall oak tree that had a rope hanging from the branch, and we'd step onto the kind of like a noose at the bottom of the rope, and then we would swing out and then drop into the middle of the pond. And we just had so much fun. And
that's wonderful.
So let's see what else I wrote. The water was really muddy. And when we went home, we had to walk up about a 5-foot bank. And maybe they were leeches, but Dad called them bloodsuckers. And we had to look all over our body to get the bloodsuckers off before we got back on the car to go home. And of course, we towel dried and sat on our towels on the ride back to Austin. But that's how we spent really hot days growing up. And I figured the year was in the 50s, maybe around 54. I think I was about 6 and my brother was 9. So
those are some great details. I mean, and the other thing that's cool about details, we don't have a lot of leeches in Nebraska. So, that's a whole new ball game for me. But in Minnesota, people are like, oh, leeches, whatever. So that's something really interesting too, is that those kinds of things tell us a lot about location, right? So yeah, that's the kind of stuff. Those are beautiful details, both of you. Thank you. And hopefully all of you will start thinking about what it is that you can share with kids and grandkids and maybe Vine even, if you want to, Mike, you could put together a repository of stories, right? And anybody could look at them. And that might be a really nice thing. Not that you necessarily want a whole nother job, but it's nice to have those kinds of stories, because you just never know when somebody's going to want something like that. And you just never know when you're going to be able to give something to somebody that they just didn't know they needed, right? And that's maybe the greatest thing about books, is that they can do that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll finish talking, and then I will have time for questions. Any questions that you would like to talk about? So I chose this particular plaque because my aunt made this plaque for my grandma, and it's ceramic and it sticks up. You can kind of see that it's 3D. But if I was writing about my grandma, I would definitely put stuff in there about how she was a Capricorn. She thought that was pretty great. And this plaque used to hang above a doorway, the kitchen doorway, in the second house that I remember her living in. The house where she lived with her second husband. And the house where I really kind of remember her being my grandma most of all. So for me, this is very special, and considering we both have the same birthday, it had to come and live at my house. So later on, my grandma had vascular dementia, which is something that's different than Alzheimer's, and it's different than a lot of other kinds of dementias. And it kind of ran in her family, and she would say things like, "Oh, I hope I don't lose my mind, because it's the most important thing." And then, of course, she did. I moved away from Nebraska in 1992, and she was getting ready to turn 80. And she died, 28 days before her 93rd birthday. And she was in the care home for the last probably 5 of them. And it's 500 miles from my hometown to Cato. So that wasn't a distance that we did very often, and I didn't get to see her a whole lot in her last years. And that really made me very sad. And she couldn't communicate very well. She could say the same words kind of over and over again, which is really what vascular dementia does. It just kind of, it messes you up in different ways than other kinds of dementias. So it was, again, a relief when she passed. But it was, there's nobody who's had an influence on me like her. And I want to read you one other thing from her. And I got this, I think it was the Valentine's Day when I was a sophomore in college. So I don't even know. I think that's right, though. So that would have been 1989. So this went to all of the grandkids. Dear Special Valentine, Hallmark has some beautiful Valentine cards. They cost about $1 a piece. I tried to think of all the things one could do with $1 besides buy a cute card that would eventually have to be thrown out because there weren't simply any place to put it. I came up with some suggestions. Oh, and the card had $1 in it. You might add some that you'd rather try. You could buy a little ring of gold safety pins in case you were getting holes in the toes of your socks, or in case the elastic in your unmentionables was beginning to get a little slack. You could buy 2 red Bic pens or 10 black Bic pens and either do your book work or write a lesson or a letter to your grandmother, who'd be glad to take time out from all her exciting adventures to read about your achievements. You could buy a big ice cream cone and lick all the sides fast enough to keep most of it off your bib, or you could buy a big Coke and get 2 straws and take your latest out for generosity. Or you could do as we used to do in the 30s when we'd all pitch in enough to get a quarter's worth of gas, drive to Holdridge, and have a Coke if anyone had another nickel, and all get home and still have some gas left. You could buy a paperback on identifying dirty dishes, complete with solutions, or possibly they'd have one on, and this is in capital letters, why grandmas can't type, complete with new rules. And then in parentheses, it says, get that one and I'll send you an extra $1. Or start a money-making project in your room under the laundry pile. Get a gerbil that is going to raise a family and get going, hoping that none of the new inhabitants make any sounds. Well, I've run out of brainstorms, but I still think my first one is the best one of all. I'll send you the dollar and you can get a Hallmark card if you want one and have a place for it to live, or you can buy a bag of overaged chips on a bargain or something else that will fit into your stomach without crowding, and have yourself a merry little Valentine's Day, knowing that your grandmother is thinking about you and wondering what you're up to. There's only one catch. I do want to know what your solution is. And then it says in a bunch of sort of dashes, it says murder. How do I do it? Because this is all full of errors. And you know very well you're my Valentine. I wish all grandmas had such nice ones. Special love, Grandma Cronn. And so since it was just Valentine's Day, I thought it might be useful to share that. She really did love us, and she loved us in the most unique and interesting ways. And I'm so glad that she did, because otherwise I literally would not be a writer. Yeah, I just wouldn't. It wouldn't be anything without her. This is a photo. This is a still from a film called The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which is a Coen Brothers film that came out in 2019. And it was about I think there were 6 different vignettes about the West. And this particular one is about a wagon train and accidentally firing on people that you didn't want to fire on. And it was filmed in Nebraska. I think it's the one that was had the woman as the protagonist. I haven't seen the film for a long time. So I included this to show you where she was buried, because they filmed this probably about, I don't know, somewhere under 50 miles from where she was buried. She was buried about 12 miles east of the Wyoming border. And if you've ever been out in that direction, you know that you can see for miles and miles in all sorts of directions. As much as I love living in Minnesota, that's what I miss about Nebraska. I miss the sky and I miss the space. So I really love that she's out there with all the space and all the creatures who live out there. And the last thing I want to read to you is a poem. And this is a poem I wrote after my dad passed, and Saturday was the 10th anniversary of my father's passing. So I thought that since I'd read some writing to you, some prose to you, I might want to read a poem as well. So this was a poem for him. As his fish out of water breaths gasp and slow to just a few, I hear a whistle telling us Wyoming coal is going to Omaha, fleeing the vast, empty, lovely West, which is the direction he glides on the sound of the next train, the next breath, and it is done. And so I wrote that trying to capture at least a little bit about that big space. That's one of the greatest things that Nebraskans have, is that great big space, even though everybody else, doesn't think it's so great. We think it's pretty great. So my grandma is going to live on, hopefully, in my 5th book, which is with my agent right now. And that book is called O is for Outsider. And the main character's name is Evelyn Josephine Chambers, Evelyn for my grandma. Chambers for a politician in Nebraska who's worked very hard there and just retired. The book is about kids with unusual brains, and that's why the drawing is here. This is a drawing that my friend Eric helped create. He's the guy who illustrated this, and so he's got some illustrations in O is for Outsiders as well. But I wanted to name that character after her just because of her unusual brain and because of how grateful I am that she passed that unusual brain on to me. We've done some stuff with it. And then the last thing I want to say is that you just can't judge the impact that you have from the vantage point that you're at. You have no idea what somebody will do with your story. You have no idea what somebody will do with the information that you shared, and what they'll create related to that information, which is why I think that you should share your stories. I mean, I had no idea what I would do with all the stuff that my grandma filled me up with. But this is another thing that she did. She was very into genealogy. And this is a page that she created about a man named Abraham Cronn. And he was born on the 20th of February, 1790. So one of the best friends that I have here in Mankato, a family friend, we've raised our children together, one day she texts me and she says, do you know there's a man in your background named Abraham Cronn? I said, yeah, I do know who Abraham Cronn is. I said, my relative related to Abraham Cronn is Kirstin Cronn, and you can't maybe read it very well, but he's down way at number 11. Kirstin Cronn was the great-great-grandfather of my great-grandfather, Chet Cronn, and my grandfather, Deward Cronn. So Abraham would be my great-great-great-grandfather. She says, wow, I found this on Ancestry.com, and I'm related to the person number 4, Hannah Cronn. Who knew that, my best friend and I are really honestly cousins. But what's amazing about this is that I didn't know that this was my grandma's until way down at the bottom. I looked, and that's her handwriting. So somehow my grandma's work has made it onto Ancestry.com. I don't know how. I didn't put it there. My friend found this there. But it's sort of one of those things. It's like, thanks, Grandma. Thanks for letting us be able to say to our kids, you actually are cousins. You actually are related. This is not just we're family. This is a honest to goodness, we're family. So she did something that, who knew, right? Who knew? She doesn't have any idea. She didn't know what impact she would create by the things that she did. She just did them because she wanted to. And so that's kind of what I want to say to you. Write those stories down because you want to, and put them out into the world somehow, and then just see what happens. Could be really good. Anyway, thanks very much. And, we're close to time, but I'm happy to stay for a little while afterwards. If you have questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and talk about whatever it is that you'd like to talk about.
I never like to be the first one, but I will get the ball rolling. One of the things that I've found when I've been writing my own memoir, and I'm writing it because my uncle Clayt, who was raised here in Mankato, North Mankato, actually wrote a book called Growing Up in Mankato in the 1930s and 40s. And
Nice.
he self-published it on Lulu, and every once in a while on Mankato Memories, somebody pops up and says, I just found this book about growing up in Mankato and it's great. And that's something that my niece has found. And then that led to the fact that Clayt's, boy, would have been like a grandmother, also wrote a book. Bessie Lagerquist wrote about growing up, and she lived, I believe, the 1870s through 1946. So
Nice.
It's interesting to have both of those copies. But as I'm working on my own, I'm finding that when you start writing with one detail, you suddenly remember other things, and the details can get pretty thick. And I'm wondering if there's a certain mixture of of details and narrative, or is there a time when there's too many details?
There is a time when there's too many details. And the question for me, I'm really good at describing the same thing like 5 or 6 times.
Okay.
And so then what I have to do is I have to look at it and I have to say, which of these are most powerful? Is this detail and this detail the most powerful? Okay, then we'll keep these. And then what you can do is create what Becky calls a parking lot. And so take all those details that you didn't use and put them in the parking lot because you might need them later on. And so that way you don't ever lose anything, but you winnow it down so your reader doesn't get bored and you still have other stuff for later. Maybe that's the way to say it. Okay. But the deal is when you're just writing a first draft, don't worry about that. When you get close to publishing, if you decide you want to send it off to the U of M press or whatever, then worry about that stuff. But in your first draft, just get it all down. No big deal. Just put it all down. Your goal is just to get it done. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, and that's kind of the attitude that I've taken because I am prolific in my writing. I am stubborn in my editing. So
yeah. And it takes a while to learn how to edit yourself. It really does. The thing that you can't do, at least in my opinion, and this is hard for beginning writers, but you can't get attached to stuff. You have to think about what your overall goal is, what's your main point, and what gets you to the main point. And if you start feeling precious about your writing, then sometimes you might go away from your goal, even though you didn't mean to. And of course, it takes practice, right? I'm plenty attached to the stuff that I write, but I've been editing long enough and have had editors edit me long enough to know that there's a story in there that you have to keep focusing on, and you can't get trapped in keeping something that doesn't stick with your story, that doesn't support your story. So sometimes that takes some practice.
Yeah. And the other thing I found is that sometimes details don't get into the parking lot, but they're like at MSU, they have the parking piranhas. You just circle around and you find that you weren't in the right parking stall to begin with, and you can take that detail and put it somewhere else.
Yep, that's very true. Yep. More questions, more thoughts?
I should say, I don't know if Bev is going to say it at all, but there is a group, actually, the Memoirs group is working on collecting some of their writings right now.
Good.
So.
Excellent. Excellent.
I have a question. I come from a family where everybody has written books except me. And I think that I have never written a book because I don't have anything to say. Although I can, writing is easy and I can tell stories, I've never written a book.
Well, then I think you need to get going, Pat. I mean, it kind of depends on what you want to do. If you don't want to write a book, then even though you have this whole family full of storytellers and they want you to, then you shouldn't. But don't be intimidated by them, because you're still going to say stuff that they're not, right? You're you and you have your experiences. And so why not, right? It's up to you. I mean, and the other thing about storytelling is that you don't want to limit yourself by thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not very good at grammar. I'm not very good at sentence structure. I'm not very good at this and that. Doesn't matter. The goal is to get it all down and then worry about that stuff later. So just write it down how you would tell your kids, how you would tell your grandkids. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, I can do that. I come from
Okay.
5 generations of newspaper writers, but
yes,
the reason I haven't written is that I feel like I have never had any thing that I wanted to say. I don't.
Well, then if you don't,
yeah,
you don't. But I think you might. I think you might want to step back and think about that, because yeah, you've had a long life, you've had an interesting life, you had this 5 generations of things. And actually, I think it would be really kind of cool if you wrote an essay that said, I don't have anything to say. Everybody else already said it. Personally, I would read that essay for sure.
Well, I sat down and started writing about my grandmother after your story. And of course, that's easy.
There you go. Grandmas are special people, man. So grateful for grandmas. Other thoughts?
Well, one thing I would say, if you are not a writer, but you want to capture some of this, probably about 10 years before he passed away, I sat down with my dad at a dining room table in their house in Bella Vista, Arkansas, and I set a electronic tape recorder in front of us, and we talked about some things that, big things in his life that I didn't really have details for. So I've got that tape sitting somewhere. And after I had written about my neighborhood growing up, and I was leaving my brothers in Kansas City, he said, oh, I've got some other stuff that that we can share. So I did a Zoom call with him, and we just sat for an hour and reminisced, and he gave me other details that I had forgotten about. And now I have that, I've got the recording of Dad, I've got the video of my brother. So it's so easy nowadays to do that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We really need to sit down and do that more often, because we all like to chat.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. And you don't even have to transcribe it. You can pay somebody else to transcribe it if you want to. But yeah, why not record people? That's a beautiful thing, right? We don't have very many recordings of my grandma. We have a few. And the other thing is, if you write something, there might be somebody who's kind of like a supporting player in your life, or like someone who's kind of on the side of your life, who might find something out that they didn't know and that really means the world to them. And I'm going to give you an example. My dad was in the Navy, and he was in Vietnam, and his ship was the only ship that was hit by a shell during the course of Vietnam. And my dad was the damage control officer on that destroyer. So my dad, of course, didn't like to talk about this. My dad didn't like to talk much about a lot of things, but some guy on his ship wrote a book about that time and about the time of the ship, about his 3 years on the ship. And my dad was maybe on that ship for, I think, like 8 months. And so I read this book and I got all this new insight into my dad's life. Now, my dad isn't anywhere in the book, and that's fine because, you know, the ship had 300 people and I'm sure that everybody knew each other a little bit, but not like a lot. And so that's fine. I don't care. But it gave me a window into my dad's time in the Navy. And I was so grateful for that. You know, my dad's been gone for 10 years. He didn't want to talk about his Navy experiences before that. So I got a gift from this person I don't even know. So sometimes writing can work like that too.
Was it Pat who said she didn't have anything to write about?
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that you come to memoirs when the pandemic is over, because that's what happens. We write a story, maybe a page and a half, and you get ideas from other people. You know, everybody's writing a memoir maybe for their children, or just a memoir of something that they've done that they thought was fun that week, but you just get ideas from other people and then you just get rolling. So
yeah,
please
there's
come
some
to memoirs.
real thing to be said for working with others when you're writing.
Yep.
And Pat says that, but I've heard some of her stories and I know she's got stories to tell.
I feel like you do, Pat, but that's just my opinion.
I think
Other questions?
I would rather live in the now and not in the past. So that's a choice, I guess.
Yep. And that's understandable sometimes. It absolutely is. Sometimes, and this is maybe not you, but sometimes the past is hard to look at. Sometimes we don't want to look at it. Sometimes it's not worth it, right? If people think that it's like boring or whatever, it's just everyday stuff. But sometimes it really is. Like one of the things that is really boring is party lines, right? Nobody understands what party lines are these days. I think party lines are the most hilarious things. We had party lines when I was little. Yeah. I was like, what the hell do you mean people are talking on my phone? My mom's like, that's not your phone. I'm like, what do you mean it's not my phone? There's people on my phone. I mean, that's the kind of silly stuff, right? Or even dialing phones, right? People don't understand dialing phones. Or hanging up. We don't understand hanging up. More thoughts? More questions?
Well, I would just encourage people to sit down and start somewhere that you have a good anchor, because it's really fun to remember those kinds of things. And even if Pat doesn't want to spend too much time in the past, it's kind of a nice little side trip to take some days.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When I was looking for stuff to read that my grandma had written, I found the stuff about her family and the Spanish flu epidemic. And she would have been 6 or 7. And her dad was very, very sick and almost died. And she didn't know that because they kept that, of course, from her. And 2 of her siblings also were sick. And I was like, holy smokes, man, I wish I could talk to my grandma about her time in the pandemic, right? Because here we are. So yeah, you just don't know.
I would say to Pat that my father, I had him before he died in the 1980. I had him do 12. He did 12 tapes for me. I asked him to do 1, and he went and bought more, and I had 12 tapes. But anyway, I got 2 books from that, and last year when I was on a trip with my grandson, he's about 25. I gave him his copy because I did one for each of the grandchildren, and he was so thrilled. And so he was cooking some of the recipes that my dad had told about. And so Pat, your grandkids or whoever is in your life would love whatever you had to say.
That's very true.
I agree.
That is a good reason to write.
Yes, it is. It is. This is the cookbook that my grandma wrote for us. And you know, I said that was 10 years. My dad's passing was 10 years on Saturday. And she wrote down his pizza recipe. My dad worked very hard to make good sauce and good dough, and it's all written down in here. And I couldn't have had that kind of sort of remembrance of him on Saturday if I hadn't had this, right? And she's got all sorts of weird stuff and comments and columns, and oh my God. Oh, my grandma had her own copy machine in the 80s. She would type letters to everybody, and she used to type them on carbon, and then, she'd send them all to all the people. But then in the 80s, she got a copy machine in her house, and she'd copy stuff and send it to you. Oh my God. She would have loved email. She would have loved it. So, yeah.
You've been copying the world.
Crazy.
Reply all, Grandma.
That's right. That's right. Oh, yes. She would have been a deal on the interwebs. More thoughts, more questions. I appreciate you listening. And it was just a lot of fun for me to talk about my grandma. I don't usually get an opportunity to do that, but I thought it was a good follow-up to Becky's presentation.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you. More questions, more thoughts? Mike can always give you my email if you need it. I'm happy to talk with you.
All right. If there's nothing else, let's give Kirstin a virtual round of applause.
Right.
I've got you all. No, some of you have snuck off of mute. So I was going to say I had you all muted. But thank you very much. I am working on something for next month. Actually, it could involve kind of a how-to of so you've always wanted to write a book. So our own Terry Davis is looking into doing that.
Oh, very good. That will be good. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
Always fun from Terry.
Well,
all right. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the sunshine. Stay warm.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.